Well, good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. My name is Jim O'Rourke. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Management and director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication. I'll be your instructor and your host for this lecture series. Thanks for being here. We've arranged a series of 7 lectures for you that I think you'll find interesting and exciting. Our aim is to engage in some structured speculation about the future, specifically the decade just ahead and the world we're likely to inhabit 10 years from now. We'll do that from a number of perspectives, but it will all be focused on one central theme: social impact. Our speakers come to us from many parts of the nation and all walks of life. Professors Lawrence Cunningham, Tzvi Novick, Rashied Omar, and James VanderKam, all of the University of Notre Dame. On the 8th of February, Roxanne Spillett of the Boys and Girls Clubs of America will be here. She'll be followed by Julia Silverman of Uncharted Play, Leo Burke from the Executive Programs Division of the Mendoza College of Business, Matthew Breitfelder of BlackRock, Patricia Deneen of Sigular, Guff & Company, and Adam Warbach of Saatchi & Saatchi. I have not printed paper syllabi for you this morning because there are a couple of dates in flux. March 1st is one of them. We realize now that that's an MBA examination date, so we've asked one of our speakers to choose an alternate date. I'll inform you on that. And as soon as Adam Warbach gets back to us on his selection of date, I'll inform you of that as well. It's likely to be late March or April, so pay attention. Open the email if it's from me. It's entirely safe. We'll gather here on 7 separate Friday mornings during the spring semester, beginning promptly at 10:40 a.m. each morning and concluding at noon. In order to make this a productive, useful experience for all, I have a few requests of you. First, please plan to arrive here on scheduled lecture dates before 10:40 a.m. I'll send you an email. Our next lecture date is Friday, the 8th of February, with Roxanne Spillett. We'll begin promptly at 10:40. I'd like you to be in your selected seat, ready to listen. Second, next time around, I should have copies of a syllabus for you. I've already emailed a PDF version of that. Third, please give our guest lecturers your full attention and complete courtesy. This means, of course, my preference for you to be fully awake and engaged in the process. No trips outside of the lecture hall, barring genuine emergencies of some sort. Fourth, please turn off your cell phones, iPods, iPads, and laptops. Please see to it that nothing electronic interferes with our ability to learn from our time together. Fifth, if you are enrolled in this course for credit, you will be required to attend all 7 lectures unless excused. I will handle exceptions to the rule personally. There are no unexcused absences. Even if an absence is justified and excused, you will need to make up the work either by watching the digital video of the day's lecture or attending another lecture on campus. See me for details. Finally, if you're enrolled in the course for credit, you'll receive a color-coded stamped attendance card at the beginning of each lecture. Please print your name on that card along with the last 4 digits of your not your social security number, your student number. We don't want your social security number. At the conclusion of each lecture, we will place receptacles for those cards at the entrances on both first and second floor. Please deposit your card as you leave. If you don't deposit the card, we'll have to chase you up in order to figure out where you were. You'll notice from the syllabus that I have sent you, we have 6 listed speaking dates. As I said, 2 of those are in flux. I'll be back to you shortly on the resolution of those dates. When our speakers conclude their remarks today, we'll offer you an opportunity to participate by asking questions. We'll have wireless microphones available, and we ask that you wait for the attendant to pass one of those to you. So let's begin the series now with our first session. Today, I'd like to introduce you to 4 distinguished scholars in the fields of divinity and theology. Lawrence Cunningham is the John A. O'Brien Professor Emeritus of Theology at Notre Dame. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books and specializes in the history of Christian spirituality. Tzvi Novick is the Abrams Chair of Jewish Thought and Culture in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. His doctorate is from Yale University, and his research centers on law and ethics in early rabbinic Judaism. Rashied Omar is a research scholar of Islamic studies and peacebuilding in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. His doctorate in religious studies is from the University of Cape Town, and his research and teaching focus on the roots of religious violence and the potential of relation for constructive social engagement and interreligious peacebuilding, with a special interest in the Islamic ethics of war and peace and international dialogue. Finally, John C. VanderKam is the John A. O'Brien Professor of Hebrew Scripture in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. Professor VanderKam's areas of scholarly interest are the history and literature of early Judaism and the Hebrew Scriptures. He is the author of numerous well-known books and scholarly articles in the field. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our panelists for this morning.
I believe we're going to go in the order this way, with myself starting first and moving in this direction. And I take it that my task today is to think a little bit about the Catholic Church. Now, there are two ways of thinking about Catholicism. One would be to think of it as a multinational corporation with the Pope at the top as the CEO, and the church kind of radiating down to the bottom with the lay people. Another way of thinking about the Catholic Church is to think about it in terms of the local church, which is to say that the Catholic Church is fully present, for example, in South Bend, Fort Wayne, with the local bishop who is in union with all other bishops, and with all these bishops in union with the Bishop of Rome, who is known as the Pope. I could make a lot of vast generalizations about the next 10 years of the Catholic Church by using either model, but what I've decided to do is to make my remarks, first of all, about the Catholic Church as a universal church, and then talk about the local church, which is the church in the United States of America. I'm going to make four very brief points about the universal Catholic Church. And then I'm going to make 3 points about the local church, the U.S. church. The first point that I would make is this about the universal church. The head of the Catholic Church is the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope. Benedict XVI will celebrate his 86th birthday this year. Now, we did have a pope at the end of the 19th century, Leo XIII, who lived to the age of 93. But generically speaking, it is quite possible that within the next 10 years we will have a new pope. The Pope doesn't control the Catholic Church in the way that the popular culture imagines it, but it does have a very strong influence on the kind of character of the church at any given time. So that today we still talk about the John Paul II papacy or Benedict's papacy, etc. The first thing that I would say is that it's going to be very interesting to speculate on what direction the papacy will take in the next 10 years. When John Paul II died, I spoke to many, many people in the press, television and newspapers and magazines, etc., and everybody was speculating about who would become the next pope. Well, there's an old saying in Rome that the candidate who enters the conclave as the Pope many times comes out still a cardinal. So we actually don't know who the next Pope is going to be. The second point that I would make about the Universal Church is this, that the vast growth of membership in the Catholic Church today is coming not from the West, but from Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of India. That is, there has been the most vigorous growth in Catholicism is happening in the non-Western world. And we can see that by simply looking at the local church in various parts of this country. When I was a kid growing up in Florida, most of the clergy came from Ireland. There weren't a lot of priestly vocations in Florida, and so there was a great surplus of priests in Ireland, and they would come and serve all through the Sun Belt, from Florida all the way through California in the smaller dioceses. Today, if you look at our own diocese, what we find is that if priests come from abroad, they tend to come from places like Sri Lanka, Nigeria, other parts of Africa. So there's been a very great cultural shift in the Catholic Church when viewed as a global reality. Thirdly, those traditional countries of the West, and I'm thinking specifically of Europe, which have been historically Catholic, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and so on, are rapidly becoming minority religions. That is, the culture still has the great echoes of the Catholic past. The cathedrals of France would be an exemplary example. But the reality of the fact is that practicing Catholics in those countries increasingly form a minority, and that is the result of what the current Pope, who understands this issue quite well, talks about the acids of modernity. Here's a fourth point, which I think a lot of people don't think about in the Catholic Church. If we get a new Pope, he's not going to come in with revolutionary new ideas. The Pope and the hierarchy typically are meant as preservers of the tradition with a capital T. They provide the continuity of the Catholic Church. Here is something that if you read a lot of history, you understand very well. All great change in Catholicism comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I could cite you many historical examples of this. In the late 12th and early 13th century, the great shift to concern for the poor of Europe and for a new way of preaching the gospel did not come from the great Pope Innocent III, but it came from a guy with very little education who was the son of a cloth merchant who described himself as basically unlettered and who revolutionized 13th century Europe. His name was Francis of Assisi. In the 16th century, during the time of the great upheaval caused by the Protestant Reformation, the reforming impulses, while they were officially designated by church authority and the Council of Trent, the real motor came from an ex-soldier with a bad leg, again, who didn't have much in the way of education, whose name was Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. All great change in the church happens through new movements. We're seeing today what are called the new church movements within Catholicism. In many ways, they run parallel to the traditional religious orders. And if I were keeping my eye on these matters, those are the movements and those are the people that I would pay attention to. Let me move very quickly to the situation of the local church. That is the church in the United States of America. Here's a peculiar statistic. It's almost a paradoxical statistic. The Roman Catholic Church in the United States of America has lost over 10% of its active members in the last decade. There are more non-practicing Catholics in the United States of America than there are members of the next largest Protestant denomination. It runs into the millions of people. Yet the growth of the Catholic Church, just in sheer numbers, is increasing. How do you explain that? How can there be a loss of many members of the church, but at the same time, the population of the church grows? And the answer very simply is this: immigration. Most important salient fact about the Catholic Church in the United States of America today is the fact that its traditional majority, white people of European extraction, etc., are rapidly being outnumbered by people who are coming from other parts of the world. It has been estimated that 40% of all Catholics in the next 20 years will speak Spanish as their first language. But that growth is coming not only from the Hispanic world, but also coming from the world of the Philippines and from Southeast Asia, etc. I'll tell you this quick story. I'm a huge soccer fan, and I'm especially a huge women's soccer fan. I go to all the women's soccer games here at Notre Dame. And a few years ago, a member of the Notre Dame soccer team, a woman, Monica Gonzalez, who has grandparents from Mexico, arranged for the Mexican national team to play the University of Notre Dame women's soccer team at a field in downtown South Bend, school field. So my wife and I went to the game. It turned out there were 4,000 Mexicans at that game, of whose existence I wasn't even aware, of this big Hispanic population in the South Bend area. And I had great fun sitting as one of the few gringos in the population, cheering for Notre Dame in Spanish. Arriba Nuestra Dama. We won, by the way. But we got ourselves badly beaten the following year. They much improved over time. So the first point I would make is this: the face of the Catholic Church in this country, and it's most conspicuous in places like the West Coast, is rapidly changing. Here's my second point. The single biggest challenge to the handing on of the faith, and I think about this a lot, is to find a way to express the values of the gospel in a culture that is rapidly changing. The first rapid change that is happening, and it's as great as the change that occurred in the dawn of the modern period with the invention of movable type, is the rapid forms of communication. I don't think we fully appreciate how fast that is happening today. And so a tradition which has traditionally been text-based or orally based has got to somehow learn to live in a world that is quite different. Even the Pope has a Twitter account. And I don't even know what a Twitter account means. This talk is written out by hand, and I'll tell you how far behind I am in things. But the culture's changing in other ways. The impact of popular culture is shaping our imagination. Marriage is rapidly changing right before our eyes. 50% of all Catholic marriages end in divorce today. That's an exponential growth from some time ago. The economic gap between the haves and the have-nots are changing. And these all present the church with great challenges. And here's my third and final point on the American church, and it's this. The day when the church can be a shelter against the larger culture is gone. My parents' generation and bleeding into my own generation saw the Catholic Church very much as a kind of a marker of identity. If you go here in the city of South Bend, you can see south of us a St. Patrick's Church, a St. Stanislaus Church. You see a Polish church, an Irish church, a Lithuanian church, a German church, etc., where people were nurtured from the time they were children going to the parochial school through high school. They lived in Catholic enclaves. That day has passed where the church can offer a kind of a shelter. If people are going to be practicing Catholics in the future, they're going to be so by intentionality. The great theologian Karl Rahner once said, the Christian of the future will either be a mystic, that is, someone who's had deep religious experience, or they won't be Christians at all. And I conclude by saying that every age brings its own crisis. So the crisis of the Catholic Church today are both the danger points that I have alluded to, the rapidly shifting cultural situation would be one, electronics communication would be another, the problem of modernity would be a third, but every crisis is also an opportunity, and we can only hope that God gives us the wisdom to engage in that opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again for the invitation to speak. Let me, on my remarks, I guess we'll perhaps develop a couple of the themes, though in a different key, as it were. The panelists have been assembled implicitly or explicitly tasked with speaking about, and perhaps even partially, given their personal religious affiliations, for three quote-unquote world religions: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And each religion can, of course, boast of a sinuous, rich history, of a distinctive, coherent, internally variegated system of symbolic thought, enormous historical importance. But when it's a matter of immediate influence today, tomorrow, in the next 10 years, then we have to think, at least at first, in quantitative terms. And we have to face the fact that there's something of a demographic gap between Christianity and Islam on the one hand and Judaism on the other, a rather significant gap. I won't bombard you with statistics, but I've calculated that if each of the panelists were to speak for a length of time proportionate to the number of adherents of his faith in the world today, then of the hour devoted to the panelists' talks, I would have the floor for 13.8 seconds. And that's with rounding up. So when it comes to Jews, it's inevitably far more important how, in terms of global impact, how other groups perceive of and act in relation to them than what Jews themselves do. But because what Jews do does, of course, to a certain degree at least, impact the perceptions of and responses of these other groups to them, and because Jews in America and Israel do, in light of a combination of past and present circumstances, themselves exert an influence on world events that's somewhat out of proportion with their numbers, there is something for me to say in this venue, and for more than 13.8 seconds. So first, some basic facts about Jews and Judaism today. 3 factors: massive emigration from Europe at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Holocaust, and Zionism and responses thereto, are largely responsible for the current demographic situation of Judaism. Whereas Jews were once spread in large numbers throughout Europe and the Muslim world, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Germany, France, Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Morocco, a tiny number of Jews now live outside of 2 countries, America, which for these purposes, among others, can include Montreal and Toronto, and Israel. And those 2 centers contain around 6 million Jews each. Let's begin with Israel, where Judaism currently exerts its greatest influence on world affairs. If this event had taken place 4 days from now, I could tell you with somewhat more confidence what the future will portend for Israel and for Israel's influence in the world, and that's because Israel is holding parliamentary elections next Tuesday. But even without the benefit of the election results, certain trends are clear. So Zionism was, from its inception, a bastion of secular Judaism. The leadership of the Zionist movement drew historically, almost exclusively from Jews who had broken with traditional observance, often well-versed in Jewish sources, but not themselves religious, either in thought or in practice. The Zionism that inspired settlement in the early 20th century and that dominated Israeli politics during the state's first decades was driven by the desire for national independence, nationalism, by a socialist vision of the transformative power of labor. They're coming from Russia and from Poland, and by the conviction that anti-Semitism wouldn't allow for genuine Jewish flourishing among the Gentiles. But it wasn't driven by religion itself, by religious belief. Israel has still never elected a religious prime minister. Now, religious Jews were never altogether absent from Zionist ranks. There has, after all, been a chief rabbi of Israel from its inception. In fact, two chief rabbis, and in fact, even before its inception. But over the past decades, and especially recently, religious Jews have become more prominent in Israeli public life, espousing an explicitly religious ideology of the land. In the meantime, the early Zionism of nation, culture, and security has lost much energy. Here's a quotation from an article by David Remnick. I was just speaking about this article with Larry before our panel, from the most recent New Yorker. And I'll identify the he to whom Remnick is referring in a moment. Here's the quotation. The way he sees the world, the service ethos of labor Zionism evaporated and dissolved, leaving behind a vacuum of values. Herzl Zionism, that is the Zionism of Herzl, one of the founders of Zionism in the late 19th century, which was based on creating security for an endangered people, dissipated. It was so powerful that the first generation had this mission to recreate the state, and it worked, he said, but only so much. My generation didn't feel an existential threat, and it was gone. What he represents, he tells his audience, is a handover of the baton from security-based Zionism to a Jewish-based Zionism. If we don't do that, it won't work. End quote. So the person whose perspective the New Yorker is challenging there is Naftali Bennett, the son of an American couple that moved to Israel, and the leader of the national religious party in Israel, Habayit HaYehudi, or the Jewish Home. And that party is expected to receive the third and even perhaps the second most seats in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, next Tuesday. This party, and religious Zionism more generally, is much less willing than other parties, even other right-wing ones, to exchange land for peace. I don't think that the increasing prominence of religious Zionism will ultimately make a Middle East peace that much harder. Not because making peace in the region is easy, but on the contrary, because it's already so difficult, and getting harder anyway for many other reasons, including the growing power of a secular Israeli right wing, and invigoration of more radical elements on the other side of the table, both in Palestine and among other key players, especially Egypt and Iran. The more relevant question, rather, may be what effect the development of religious Zionism will have on views of Israel abroad, and on all the implications that follow from those views. On the one hand, the probable unwillingness of religious Zionism to talk the talk, to put land for peace on the table, at least in principle, to champion, at least in principle, a multicultural, multi-religious Israel, will lose Israel some of the support that it enjoys, already limited to a certain extent among liberals in Europe and in America. On the other hand, its more religious rhetoric may make Israel even more appealing to some of Israel's Christian supporters in America. On the whole, though, this development is probably going to undermine Israel's overseas support. I don't want to leave the topic of Israel without underscoring that the country's global impact isn't limited to the question of Middle East politics, as the newspaper headlines would have one believe. Israel is the source of a remarkable amount of scientific innovation, especially in the areas of agriculture, computer engineering, medical engineering, sustainable energy, and defense. For more details, I refer you to a 2009 book that's received quite a bit of attention in business circles, Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle. Whether Israel's success in these areas has anything particularly Jewish about it is an open question, and when speaking about Judaism, it's always difficult to disentangle the national, ethnic, religious dimensions. But this book to which I just referred, in any case, does attribute it, at least in part, to certain practices that are characteristic of Ashkenazi Judaism, and have left their imprint on Israeli culture generally, such as tolerance for and indeed encouragement of critique, even to the point of offensiveness. Israelis are famously or infamously frank. Let's turn now to America, where the other half of world Judaism lives. In America, the quote-unquote Jewish vote was, in the first half of the 20th century, an important factor in national politics. Jews constituted a full 4% of the voting public, and were heavily concentrated in New York, which then wasn't only the most populous state in America with the most electoral votes, but actually a battleground state. Things are different now. Jews constitute only 2% of the voting public. Jews still congregate in New York, but not as densely. And New York itself matters less, as it has fewer electoral votes, and more importantly, on the national level, is indelibly blue. On the other hand, there are more Jews in Florida, a swing state, and indeed the Jewish vote may well have allowed President Obama to carry Florida in 2008. Whatever the impact of the Jewish vote, it has been and remains reliably Democrat, to the tune of over 70%. But I want to highlight here two interrelated and specifically religious factors that have led to some defections and will likely lead to more in the coming years. The first, to harken back to our earlier discussion, is the relationship between America and Israel. This relationship is never far from the headlines, and most recently we've been reminded of this by President Obama's recent nomination of Senator Chuck Hagel for the position of Secretary of Defense, a nomination that's come under fire because of, among other things, Hagel's record on Israel. Now, among American Jews, there's a very wide variety of views on the state of Israel and how America ought to position itself toward Israel, including a number of ultra-Orthodox Jews who oppose the state quite vociferously. Nevertheless, there is a pro-Israel consensus among self-identifying American Jews. Most American Jews who see themselves as Jewish want America to count Israel as a friend, and that means, among other things, loyalty, even partiality. I don't see this basic fact changing in the near future. What this will mean for the Jewish vote in national elections will depend in part on the particular candidates, but it's fair to say that American Jews now see Republicans in general as friendlier than Democrats toward Israel, in the sense of the word friend that I just described. And reasonably so. I just referenced the attempt in the 2012 election to remove from the Democratic Party platform a commitment to Jerusalem being Israel's capital. So that's one factor that might lead in the future, in coming years, to defections among the American Jewish population from Democrat to Republican. The second important factor when it comes to national politics and American Jews is the denominational balance. American Judaism divides itself roughly into three denominations. The most traditional is Orthodox Judaism, which is either ultra-Orthodox, and those are the ones that you see on television in fur hats and long sidelocks, and others who think more or less similarly but don't dress as distinctively. So either ultra-Orthodox or modern Orthodox, that is more engaged with the modern world, send their children to universities and the like. At the other extreme, and I'm bracketing out non-identifying and secular Jews who, in fact, represent an enormous percentage of American Judaism. At the other extreme is Reform Judaism, the least traditional of the denominations, and in the middle, Conservative Judaism. Orthodoxy has long been by far the smallest denomination, but it's increasing significantly in size and strength due to losses on the less traditional end from assimilation and intermarriage, and gains on the more traditional end as a result of the general worldwide increase in religious affiliation and, more concretely, to a much higher birth rate. So the median age of Reform and Conservative Jews in America is respectively 50 and 52. The median age of an Orthodox Jew in America is 44. Both modern and ultra-Orthodox Jews skew more Republican than other Jews, the modern Orthodox because of their affinity for Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox because of their conservative views on social issues. So those are the points I'd want to make about recent developments and expectations for the near future in Israel and America when it comes to Judaism and the impact of Jews. I'll just turn in conclusion to kind of giving a different framework for the discussion that we're having here, at least the possibility of setting on a different frame. One might discuss the future, not so much the future impact of Jews and Judaism as the insight that a Jewish perspective affords into the future. So that kind of project would assume that religious communities, religious worldviews are distinctive enough that each can offer not only a different vision of how the world ought to be, but different insight into how the world is and how it will be. I'm not altogether certain that this assumption is true, but let's suppose that it is. And at any rate, as a scholar of Jewish theology, rather than of Jewish history or of political science, I'm perhaps better qualified to speak to the question that this assumption undergirds, that is, what looking at the world through Jewish-tinted glasses what kind of insight that might afford one, than to the question of the future global impact of Judaism in itself. And when it comes to Judaism, this different perspective is perhaps especially helpful because, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, Jews represent such a small percentage of the world's population that it's probably more productive to think in terms of the insight that looking at the world through those Jewish-tinted glasses might afford than the future global impact of Judaism itself. So I wanted to just put that forward as a different way we might address this question of 10 years hence and religion, and one that's particularly relevant for Judaism. But as for what, in fact, a Jewish perspective, what insight one might gain into the future from a specifically Jewish perspective, that I'll perhaps leave to question and answer if we have time. Thank you very much.
Good morning. As people of faith, and more particularly for us as Muslims, we are indeed living in troubled and stressing times. Never before in contemporary times has the Muslim commitment to world peace and to coexistence been challenged as it has been in recent times. We are living, and people have described the age in which we are living. Martin Marty and Scott Appleby has described it as late modernity. Others have described it as post-modernity. But we have the advantage of hindsight. And hopefully, we have begun to recognize that the hegemonic worldview of so-called secular modernity is not the panacea of all of the ills of our societies. Hopefully that's the case. We who live in this age of late modernity or post-modernity are beneficiaries or recipients of great human progress, and we've already heard about the advances in technology and human progress. But we are also victims of what scholars such as our very own professor here at Notre Dame, Professor Fred Dallmeyer, and others have referred to as the so-called underside or the dark side of modernity. That is the immense direct and structural violence wrought by modernity and the increased spiritual vacuum that is left among many people all over the world. So this dark side of secular modernity and its contradictions are appearing in ugly forms in many parts of the world. Interestingly, that it was diagnosed more than a half a century ago by Martin Luther King Jr. when he spoke about what he called the giant triplet of evils, namely that of racism, of materialism, and of militarism, which in one way or another is still dominating us. Racism means, hatred of the other, whether it be the religious other, the ethnic other, the linguistic other, the human differences. Materialism, consumerism, and militarism. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about, the giant triplet of evil. It is, however, in the arena of materialism and consumerism that our contemporary crisis is most deeply felt. We have at least now 5 years since 2008. We have been living through what many have described as one of the most challenging moments of our recent economic history. And, sometimes it goes and sometimes it's there. Many analysts are, in fact, claiming that the current economic downturn in the US and elsewhere is comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And almost on a daily basis, we are confronted in the media with either economists or politicians wrangling and debating about what are the best strategies to get us out of this financial crisis. I draw your attention to these developments, not to scare you, but in order to say that the vulnerability of our economy as we move into the next decade indeed is one of the most important challenges that lies ahead of us. Now, what does all of this mean for us? It's already been experienced in Europe, is increasing as our economies decline, and we've already heard about immigrations and globalization, an increase in what we call as xenophobia. As we compete for resources, we begin to blame immigrants that they are taking away our jobs. I give you this example, and as a result of this also, the other idea of modernity, this great thing that we call nationalism, also comes increasingly under pressure. I give you an example from where I come from in South Africa. We had this great struggle against racism, and in 1994 brought to power a great leader called Nelson Mandela. And in 2008, we had one of our worst crises when many of the people who had been part of this great anti-apartheid struggle began to kill other Africans who were moving south in search of work and better economic conditions. So before 1994, we never thought of ourselves as South Africans. Whenever we had a soccer game or a cricket game, we would support the opponents. In 1994, we got a flag, and we have a national anthem. And then we begin to see those who come from Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, as others taking away our jobs. It simply means that in the immediate future, we will all need to brace ourselves for challenging economic times that lie ahead. And I would believe that faith and religion can provide a shelter and a solace in this time of crisis. And notwithstanding the despondency which abounds, this is the meaning of faith. Faith means giving people hope, giving people perseverance. And so the role of religion and faith will be to keep alive the lamp of hope, showing the pathways leading humanity to safety and felicity. All the good actions, from my perspective of faith, such as prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, are endeavors in the search of God. And the search for God is a sign of hope. It enables a believer to perceive the good that exists in the world, and this is a fruit and a mark of divine action in human hearts. Thank you for your patience.
None of us knows what will happen later today, much less tomorrow or 10 years hence. What we can do is pause to consider some larger patterns or trends of the recent past and make some educated guesses about what is likely to be the case in the years ahead. One prediction that can be made with a great deal of confidence is that religion will be an important factor in society 10 years from now. We can define the term religion in various ways, but if we mean by it the sorts of things that adherents of the great world religions do and believe, say Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and the like, it will be a part of public life that it would be perilous to ignore. It will be around inspiring people to believe and act in certain ways, such as advocating causes and investing their resources. I am a Protestant and want to speak from that perspective and about Protestantism in this country. I firmly believe that, as they have been throughout American history, Protestant churches, and perhaps to a greater extent, Protestant groups and individuals, will be a force in the foreseeable future. The Protestant movement began in the 16th century as a reaction against perceived abuses in the Catholic Church, the single Western church at the time. It was also a product of key historical changes in society, nations, the economy, and so on. Protestantism has always been a diverse phenomenon, and never more so than today, with the result that it is difficult to define it, but there are some traits that Protestants share. The central one of these is adherence to the Bible, Old and New Testaments, as the final authority on matters having to do with one's life, one's service of God, the way one thinks and believes. Adherence to the Bible is a shared trait, but there are many ways in which to interpret it so that there's a range of inferences Protestants derive from the one Bible. Protestantism has historically found expression in denominations, with the best-known ones being Anglicans or Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, the Reformed, Methodists, Baptists, and the like. Those denominations have developed in their own ways in this country and have shaped its character. Protestantism is actually much more diverse than just these better-known denominations, each of which is subdivided into its own smaller denominations. As of 2010, there were supposed to be some 38,000 denominations worldwide, involving something like 4 million individual congregations. Some features of Protestantism that are evident today will continue, I suspect, into the near future, and perhaps become more pronounced. First, a gradual breaking down of traditional denominational identity and loyalty. Protestant denominations have arisen for different reasons, political or national reasons being prominent among them. As a result, the Anglican Episcopalian churches have roots in England, the Lutherans in Germany and Scandinavia, Presbyterians in Scotland, and so on. In the great American melting pot, those national identifications were likely to grow weaker as the distance in time from the home country became greater, and that has happened slowly over the generations. Intermarriage, convenience, and other factors have led to a blurring of denominational lines in the sense of national blocks as people have moved back and forth between them. Missions have also contributed to the change in ethnic affiliation. There are more Korean Presbyterians today than ones from any other national background. The so-called mainline denominations remain important, counting millions of members, but the face of American Protestantism has undergone a large change. And I quote from Mark Knoll, one of the history faculty here at Notre Dame. Over the last half century, he says, the once dominant mainline churches, the ones I've mentioned, while maintaining large and relatively well-funded denominations, have yielded public space to a multitude of more evangelical, fundamentalist, Pentecostal, sectarian, holiness, independent, and immigrant churches. Careful empirical research suggests that mainline Protestants now make up about 15% of the American population, with another 26% in mostly Caucasian, evangelical, or conservative Protestant churches, and 9% in the largely Protestant African American churches. The other half of the population divides 20% Catholic, 10% other religious groups, and 20% functionally unattached. End of quote from Mark Knoll. Second, that change regarding denominations may be related to another factor, and that is the way that Protestants and others contribute to politics and public life. People tend not to exert their influence politically through a denomination, but rather through other kinds of organizations that are associated with a cause. Take abortion, for example. Churches, whether the Catholic Church or mainline Protestant denominations, have taken stances on the modern forms of abortion, and those responsible for public policy have had to take note of this. But the strength of the pro-life movement does not come from a particular church or denomination, but from the large number of people from diverse Christian and other backgrounds who have rallied to it. This has, as the saying goes, made for some strange bedfellows. Traditionally, the relations between Catholics and conservative Protestants have been at least chilly and often worse. Sometimes people in one camp question whether those in the other are even Christians. But many Catholics and conservative Protestants, and obviously not all of them, have joined to back the pro-life cause. An issue, not a church organization, has galvanized people into common action. It is interesting, I think, that according to exit polls, more Catholics voted for the pro-choice President Barack Obama than for the pro-life Governor Mitt Romney. Official church pronouncements do not necessarily settle matters for people these days. Third, related to the matter of rallying around causes is the entry of conservative Protestants into the political process. If I remember correctly, and I was in North Carolina in the 1980s, teaching at North Carolina State University, and thus could observe developments there firsthand. It was during the two elections won by Ronald Reagan that some Protestants who had traditionally shunned the arena of politics, preferring to be detached from such worldly matters, got involved in the election campaign, or at least voted in large numbers. I remember thinking it was ironic that a Hollywood actor and a divorcee, hardly an admirable combination for conservative Protestants, was the one these people supported. But the conservative message he brought was what attracted them, or perhaps it was the fear of what the other side advocated that alarmed them. Quoting again from Mark Knoll, much world attention has focused on the American Protestants who came after the black civil rights leaders and who also brought direct religious influence into politics. These have been largely conservative white evangelicals. Although most white evangelicals eventually accepted civil rights for black Americans, many objected to the expansion of government authority it took to enforce civil rights. Even more, they objected when court rulings and federal legislation banned prayer and Bible reading in the public schools, legalized abortion on demand, and relaxed restrictions against homosexual practice. The result was a new Christian right. This political movement linked conservative white Protestants to the Republican Party and played a significant role in electing Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. End of quotation from Mark Knoll. A term one hears often these days is evangelical. The label covers a broad range of conservative Protestants, all the way from fundamentalists to the kind of tradition from which I come, the Reformed, which prides itself on theological education. Evangelicals are a sizable group that spans denominations and nationalities. It is especially for the more conservative side of the evangelical movement that issues such as evolution versus creationism are important. People have read the first chapters of the Bible in different ways, but some conservative folk are convinced those chapters teach a six-day process of creation that took place only a few thousand years ago. They are sincere in what they believe, though they look to many outsiders as anti-science, know-nothings who ignore evidence if it conflicts with their assumptions. My point is not to praise or criticize them, but to say that they are a factor in public life and probably will continue to be so for some time. The last election showed that this part of the ecclesiastical world of American Christianity has the ability to make itself heard, even though the same election demonstrated they do not speak for a majority of Christians or Americans in general. The Affordable Care Act looks to many of them as another overreach of government into a place where it does not belong. So I've mentioned three trends that I think are likely to continue over the next decade and probably beyond. First, a gradual breakdown of traditional denominations, or at least a change in the nature of the historic membership. Second, causes being more likely to unite Protestants and others than ecclesiastical loyalties. And third, evangelicals exercising influence in American politics. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have microphones for those of you who would like to ask a question. And let me begin. Let me offer the first question, and Larry Cunningham. Two issues that you did not refer to directly that affect the Catholic Church of the early 21st century would, of course, be the pedophilia scandal and the presumption that there has been a decline in the number of vocations among sisters, brothers, and priests in this country. But you didn't refer to those as crises. You referred to modernity and to some other issues. Do you consider those two issues to be crises? And has there been a concerted effort on the part of the Church to address and resolve those?
Excuse me, if I were to begin to list the number of crises in the Catholic Church, we would be here till 5 o'clock this afternoon. Let me say something about the vocational crisis in this country. There are probably many reasons for it. Let me say something which a lot of people don't understand. Let's start with religious women. Not having much going on in my life, a year or so ago, I sat down with the Catholic Directory and I looked at the whole list of religious communities of women in the United States of America. There are about 500 of them. We have the Holy Cross Sisters across the road from us. If you bracket out the contemplative orders, the cloistered nuns, 90% of those communities were founded after the French Revolution. They're a modern phenomenon in the church. So religious communities of women, Sisters of St. Joseph, Sisters of St. Francis, and so on and so forth, are basically something new in the Catholic Church if you look at its 2,000-year history. And there is a correlation to be made between the rise of opportunities for women in the culture in general and the decline of women going into these active religious communities. When I was a kid, every teacher in my school was a religious sister. You would be hard-pressed to find a school in this country where that would be true today. What happened? Women went into law, they went into business, they went into medicine. Over half the students in medical school today are women. So what is happening is that what we think of as existing for centuries and centuries and centuries is actually a kind of a passing phenomenon in the world. The same is true to a certain degree in the priesthood. That was a prestigious way. Every Catholic family wanted to have a son who was a priest. But with the rapidly changing way in which our culture is moving, and such things as the failures of the clergy and the demand of celibacy in the Western Church, etc., that has changed. Those are crises in the sense that they leave a certain lack of leadership, but they are also an opportunity, in my estimation, to ask this question: what is the future of the priesthood, or what is the future of the religious life going to look like? And how is it going to be different in the future? Maybe these new church movements, Focolare, Opus Dei, Sant'Egidio community, Catholic worker movement, etc., will provide us models for the future. I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, but at the same time, I think that what's going to happen, especially if you take the long view of history, is that there are going to be radical changes in the way in ministry, in which ministry is going to be observed.
Very good. Thank you.
By the way, I'm an old 40-year veteran of the classroom, so when we ask for questions, we'll wait a minute and maybe we'll start calling on people. So someone be brave and raise your hand if you have a question for anyone and come to the microphone.
Oh, thanks. Professor Cunningham has begun to answer my question, but I would have put it this way: given that you aren't looking for anything revolutionary in the next pope, would it be revolutionary to allow women to serve as priests? It seems to me this is a very important matter, and I was going to ask regarding Islam something similar, which is not just whether women could serve as clergy, but whether they could have a larger role in Islamic culture than they usually do. So one question is whether we can find parts of the Quran or the Sharia that can be magnified. This seems to me to be a terribly important phenomenon for the future of Islam and the world.
I think I'll let Professor Rashied start while I collect my thoughts.
Well, if you're fighting in the Catholic Church to get women to be ordained as priests, unfortunately, I have bad news that in the Muslim world, we are fighting to get women into the mosque. But this is changing, and there are different kinds of cultural expressions of Islam. Islam is not a monolithic entity. So if you go to Africa, Southeast Asia, you'll find large amounts of women in mosques, very active and so on. When you go to South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you find women are not allowed in the mosque in many, many cases and many instances. There is nothing, though we don't have formal ordination of clergy. You have to follow a specific, course of study. And there's nothing that prevents women from becoming scholars of Islam. Unfortunately, that's not been the case in more recent times. The good news is that, at the international level, just 2 weeks ago, the International Society of Muslim Scholars allowed some women, to belong to them. So, it's a far way to go, and this is part of of the struggles that we'll see in the next 10 years.
I would go back to a point that I made earlier, and that is that if anyone expects the next pope to announce that he's going to begin ordaining women, simply doesn't understand the function of hierarchical authority and teaching in the Catholic Church. It doesn't happen from the top down, typically a radical change. I'm an old guy, and I don't expect to see ordination of women in the Catholic Church in my lifetime, either with this pope or the next pope, because of the great weight of tradition with a capital T. I do think that there's going to be an evolution of ministries. For example, we now have permanent deacons in the Catholic Church. Married men who function as deacons. I was one of the instructors of the last class of deacons in this diocese. And there's much discussion going on today about the ordination of women as deacons. There's some evidence that there were deacons, good evidence in the early church. And if the issue of women deacons becomes a reality, then that raises the very interesting question: do they participate in the sacrament of holy orders? And if so, why deacons and not priests? But that's something I think that's going to happen slowly and probably not from the top down.
Other questions?
For the first speaker, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, on the Catholic Church. You talked about the decline in need for the enclave in ethnic groups. I was wondering if that's just the case for the U.S., because I did see a lot of that in Europe in the Protestant communities. There still seems to be a lot of, strength in ethnic churches and the way that they draw immigrants in. And I was wondering if there's anything the church can do to preserve that in the U.S., since we do still have a lot of waves of immigration.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
I remember you saying the decline in the Catholic enclaves, like in the South Bend community, the Lithuanian church and all that. And I was wondering if that's something that the Catholic Church is trying to preserve.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I should qualify that by saying that what happens is that the character of ethnic enclaves changes. So, for example, a local parish here in South Bend, St. Adalbert's, is traditionally a Polish parish, and there are still people that live in that area that attend that church. But it largely has become a Hispanic church today. That is, the ethnic groups tend to change over time. The vast demographic shift in the American Catholic Church, say after 1950, was that largely urban-centered parishes that identified themselves ethnically, that is, the Italian parish or the Polish parish or whatnot. And every time I drive through Chicago on the Dan Ryan, I can see those churches all over Chicago. What has happened is that as Catholics became more successful financially and economically, etc., they tended to exit from those ethnic parishes and move to the suburbs. Therefore, you find in many large cities, this is a big problem for bishops, you find these large ethnically founded parishes in the inner city that basically have very, very few congregants anymore because the people have moved to the suburbs. In a place like South Bend, the vacuum has been filled mainly by largely Mexican immigration. When you go to other parts of the world, what you find is that the Catholic Church still serves as a kind of a shelter for people, especially if they live in countries where there is not a large Christian or Catholic population. In Israel, for example, there are Catholic churches in which the congregants largely are people from the Philippines and other parts of the world.
Other questions? Let me pose one to Professor VanderKam, if I may. Professor, I grew up in a small town in Montana, and my Catholic parish was largely composed of people I knew by first name. I attended parochial schools, and I came to think of parishes as being of a certain size. As an Air Force officer, I was assigned to the American South, and I came in contact with the first of a number of mega churches that I have seen. These were astonishing phenomena that included daycare and bowling alleys, and it was just remarkable in the extreme. I'm wondering if you could say a few things about the growth of such churches and what you think the future of the mega church may be. Is this a phenomenon associated with charismatic personalities who lead them, or is this a phenomenon independent of that?
I'm no expert on this subject. I had the same sort of background you described for yourself, coming from an ethnic kind of place where I knew virtually everyone in my church, and they all had surnames like mine because we were all from Dutch extraction. But the rise of the mega churches, that is the ones that I'm aware of, I think it is often the case that they gather around a charismatic leader who these churches then develop into sizes like 25,000 members or something like that have all the features you talked about, along with gymnasiums. And that's one of the attractions of them, I gather, all of these services that can be, I don't mean services in the sense of church services, but in the sense of all that can be, the daycare and things of that sort. So also you have very talented people involved in these churches because they tend to have a lot of money available to hire experts to do them. So I think they clearly serve a purpose. And apparently outside the U.S., there are even larger mega churches of this sort. I think the Granger Community Church is one in this particular area, which obviously has a very large influence. I think, too, that there are some people who are turned off by them. I'm one of them, and much prefer the smaller kind of organization to that. But if you have a church with 25,000 people, it's got a good chance to be more influential in public than the much smaller ones traditionally.
I think we have time for a couple more. Surely there's a question or two here somewhere.
Hello, this is for the speaker on Judaism. I hope the question's not too far off, but I think you mentioned something about studies in religious violence and the origination of religious violence. I was just wondering if there's much theological thought or academic thought as to the differences of maybe violence in the Scripture from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and then maybe Jesus and the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay. I did touch on religious Zionism, and then the opposition within religious Zionism to exchange of land for peace, and that's that ideology isn't so much arising from a kind of set of commitments about war and peace. That's more arising from an ideology of the land, that is the holiness of the land, the sense that the land has been bequeathed as an inheritance to the Jewish people, and hence is non-negotiable. So that's more the ideology from which religious Zionism is coming. Of course, it does have implications for religious violence, And in general, the founding of the State of Israel has kind of resurrected a lot of traditional thought in Judaism about questions of violence in the state, the military. For a couple of millennia, Jews were stateless, and hence all the entire area of public law and the possibility of inflicting violence were kind of largely marginalized as topics of discussion simply because they weren't relevant. So certainly since the founding of the state, that's become a major area of thought. And of course, there are, as in any religious tradition, many, a whole spectrum of views on which one could rely, and great debate. I would say that the commitments of religious Zionism do entail certain commitments about the willingness to commit violence. I mean, the kind of acts of Jewish terrorism that one hears about coming out of Israel, for example, the killing of 29 Muslims in a mosque in Hebron, by a Jewish settler, Baruch Goldstein. That is the kind of violence that emerges, that can emerge from religious Zionist circles. I shouldn't exaggerate that is by no means characteristic of religious Zionism as a whole, and roundly condemned by all responsible religious Zionists. But there's certainly the ideology of the land certainly does come with that dark side, as it were. I don't know if
One more.
I know when you're looking historic or looking at 10 years hence, you have to look at past history. And with the recent shift in the Supreme Court in the last 50 years to being more of a Catholic court, do any of you see a big shift coming in the near future where we're going to have more religious affiliations represented on the Supreme Court as they're making major decisions and recent appointments are going to be made in the near future, assumedly?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question.
I'll just, start with that, but anyone can feel free to jump in. As it stands now, of course, there is that curious fact that all the members of the court are either Catholic or Jewish, right? It's interesting. I suppose that the level of decision making or kind of overt reliance on religious discourse, it's difficult to imagine kind of that becoming more widespread over the next decade or in the future. But general kind of respect for religious affiliation. I'm not familiar. I do actually have something of a law school background, but I'm hardly familiar with the most recent developments in First Amendment doctrines. But the general trend certainly has been toward a greater recognition of religious assembly and evaluation of religious life. But as for explicit religious affiliation being kind of explicitly drawn upon by justices, that I have trouble seeing, though it's an interesting possibility.
I think, Jim, it is very interesting. There are no mainline Protestants. There are no Protestants at all on the Supreme Court. The majority are Roman Catholic and the minority Jewish. And that may say something about a cultural shift in its own right. I don't know if you'd want to comment on that.
Well, I certainly don't know very much about it, but it seems that we Protestants should get the next seat in the appointment. But it's kind of hard for me to imagine that would be a terribly important criterion by whichever president makes that particular appointment.
Well, very good. One more thought?
Just to kind of speculate on that. I mean, it is interesting, just kind of given the role of the judiciary, certainly kind of in the since the 50s forward, as kind of seeing its role in part as protection of minority rights. the rights of minorities, there is something, I suppose, fitting in the filling of the judicial roles by Catholics and Jews rather than mainline Protestantism. So there is something of a fit, but again, I would be skeptical about kind of overt religious affiliation on the part of judges.
Before we thank our guests, let me remind you that we'll gather again here on Friday, the 8th of February, to hear from Roxanne Spillett from the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. You'll get an email from me, and hopefully by then, an update on our other speakers' date selections. Please help me thank our panelists for today.